So here we're getting into our next key concept, experiments versus non-experiments. Now, chances are throughout your education, K-12, college education, you've heard of experiments, but maybe you haven't yet heard of this term non-experiment. So let's go ahead and explore what the difference between these two ideas are, or is. Either way, experiments. We'll start with experiments. In an experiment, a researcher can control the research situation by manipulating one or more independent variables. And so, I put the cause here in parentheses just to reinforce that, making that association between independent variables and thinking of them as our cause variable. The manipulation happens when a researcher assigns the independent variable to one group of people, which we would then refer to as the experimental group, but withholds it from another group, which we would then refer to as the control group. So I want to bring back this example of video games and levels of aggression. So as a reminder, where the hypothesis here was that playing video games will increase levels of aggression. We determined that we have two variables here. Our independent variable is gaming or playing video games, and our dependent variable is levels of aggression. In the experiment group, the experiment group would play a video game and then be surveyed to determine their levels of aggression. So as the researcher, I'm assigning one group, the experimental group, to play the video game and determine, what is their level of aggression. The control group, on the other hand, does not play the video game, but are still surveyed to determine their levels of aggression. In order for us to make this comparison, to research this idea that playing video games increases levels of aggression, we have to have a group that doesn't play video games, our control group, and a group that does play video games, the experiment group. Now let's turn our attention to non-experiments. So again, you might be a little bit more familiar with the term experiments, and in the context of behavioral statistics and social sciences, we also have this idea of non-experiments. Non-experimental research examines the relationship between variables, but the researcher cannot control independent variables. So what does this mean? An example would be researching the hypothesis, does race affect the number of times someone interacts with police? Now, as a sociologist, this is, certainly a question that would come up in sociological research, talking about racial identity and interactions with police. And so we have our hypothesis, does race affect the number of times someone interacts with police? And identifying our two variables, one of which is race as our cause variable, and the other of which is the number of times someone interacts with police as our dependent variable. So this is suggesting, this hypothesis suggests a relationship between racial identity and police interactions. The independent variable is race. The dependent variable is police interactions. In this example, the researcher cannot control someone's racial identity. That is, that the researcher can't assign people to a racial category. So what does this mean? In the context of an experiment, the researcher is able to manipulate who is playing video games and who is not playing video games. In the context of a non-experiment, the researcher cannot look at a group of people and say, okay, you have this racial identity, you're going to have this other racial identity. The researcher cannot make the determination of someone's racial identity. And so in this context, the researcher does not control the independent variable. So in non-experiments, the independent variable is often called quasi-independent because it cannot be controlled. And so we want to, keep in mind this distinction between experiments and non-experiments. Remember that experiments allow a researcher to control and manipulate independent variables, while in non-experiments, the researcher cannot control the independent variables.